Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and this is not a video that's based on any specific paper or any specific study. It is, however, based on science fiction, and it's a video that I sort of have been meaning to make for a while, mostly because it's a tradition I usually go through every New Year's when I get some time to watch some movies, relax with my family, and basically do some fun stuff that doesn't involve extremely thorough research about some space discoveries or other science stuff. And here I just wanted to talk more about this idea of futurism, or trying to predict future and trying to see where all of this takes us. Specifically, here we're going to be talking about this year 2022. So what do we think this year is going to be like? And more importantly, what do we think previous years were like, according to some really popular science fiction movies? So in other words, what we're going to try to do is predict the future by using some of the most famous sci-fi movies available to us today, with the only requirement for all of these movies is that they actually had to be set in 2022, with many of them filmed decades prior. And this is actually a somewhat interesting approach because it relies on this idea of a kind of a collective prediction of the future. So futurism, but from a slightly different approach. And this idea of futurism, or predicting the future using science or science fiction, is obviously not new, with the iconic Arthur C. Clarke that you see right here probably being the most famous futurist, with a lot of his predictions eventually coming true. For example, he was the first to predict that we're going to have telecommunication satellites located in a very specific orbit around planet Earth. And today, just to commemorate his prediction, this is often referred to as the Clarke Belt, even though officially it's known as geostationary orbit. But some of his predictions didn't really pan out. He predicted that we'll land on Mars in the 90s, and we didn't. He also predicted that we're not going to land on the moon by the 70s, and we did. So he has admitted to being wrong several times. But instead of looking at individual predictions by individual scientists or science fiction authors, I wanted to basically do it as a kind of a whole. With the only requirement here being that the movies had to be from, I guess, at least a decade ago or slightly older, because obviously it would make sense that a movie made in 2021 was predicting what's going to happen in 2022. Here it would have to be made at least 10 years ago. And the thing is, when I started doing this a few years ago, I realized that some of the predictions in science fiction movies turned out to be really accurate, or surprisingly accurate. For example, some of the movies that were based on 2021 was the movie Mission to Mars, and although we didn't have a manned mission to Mars, we did have an extremely hyped mission to Mars from 3 different countries, so in some sense there are definitely some parallels between what actually happened and the ideas from this movie itself. We also have this much older movie from 1969 with the title Moon 02, where the premise is a former astronaut that helps a millionaire space industrialist capture a huge asteroid while helping some lady save her brother. And I guess a millionaire in the 60s is technically a billionaire in the 2000s. And although we didn't really have actual asteroid capture in 2021, we sure heard a lot about billionaires in space, with some of the former astronauts also helping those billionaires. So once again, some parallels here. But I think the coolest movie that was set in 2021 has to be this, Johnny Mnemonic, the movie that was actually filmed in my home city of Montreal, and that basically is set in this kind of a cyberpunk future with no one else but Keanu Reeves in the main role. And we've definitely seen a lot of Keanu Reeves in 2021, a lot of cyberpunk, including some of the biggest video games that were cyberpunk. But more importantly, the story here is about a world dominated by mega corporations with a lot of East Asian influences, and of course some brain implants here and there. A lot of this did happen in 2021 to some extent. And obviously I'm kind of pushing it here, but I definitely see some parallels. But I guess my favorite prediction in this case would also be related to my thumbnail on Twitter. I posted this here on YouTube as well. November 2019, that's essentially when Blade Runner is set as well. Dystopian dark world, dominated by mega corporations, and a lot of negative stuff here and there. And a lot of pollution issues, and of course other social issues as well. Now, about a month after this, we sort of know what happened. That's the start of the pandemic. And although obviously it doesn't portray the world that we experienced afterwards, the dystopia it creates definitely reflected the world that we found ourselves in 2020. With some other notable movies being Geostorm, which predicted some sort of a major disaster, which I guess didn't really succeed in predicting an actual geostorm, or any major disasters to begin with. and a movie called Daybreakers that basically is about vampires farming humans for their blood. So maybe not as many parallels or predictions from this either. But despite these shortcomings, there are still 5 movies that I found that are set in 2022 that do actually make some really intriguing predictions, with some of them potentially maybe coming true. Let's take a look at them. The first on the list is Alien Intruder. This is from 1993, and it's actually a movie that I haven't seen until relatively recently, mostly because I basically found it by looking at the movies set in 2022. And the premise here is somewhat intriguing. It involves a crew of what seems to be former prisoners on some sort of an exploration mission to an abandoned ship. So far, I don't expect any of this to happen. But afterwards, it turns into what seems to be a virtual reality film. Basically, each of these astronauts start experiencing virtual reality, and I don't want to spoil the rest, but you can kind of see where this is going. There are definitely some parallels with the buzzword that's essentially everywhere now, the metaverse. And a lot of the virtual reality presented in this movie is somewhat intriguing. It's definitely worth checking out. Then there's this, Soylent Green. I think this would be the most iconic movie set in 2022. And let me just read you the description of the movie, just to show you how many parallels there are with modern world. This movie involves an investigation into the murder of a wealthy businessman in a dystopian future of dying oceans, year-round humidity, excessive greenhouse effect, resulting in pollution, poverty, overpopulation, euthanasia, and depleted resources. Sounds familiar? Yeah, too familiar. And considering that this is based on a science fiction book from 1966, it's definitely one of these movies that's a must-see for 2022. And it also has the iconic Charlton Heston that you see right there in the main role. But then we have 3 other movies that are maybe not as prophesizing, they might not predict the future as well, but are still worth watching. We have No Escape, set in 2022. Once again, dystopian future, but this time some sort of a prisoner island from which someone is trying to escape. It's actually a pretty good action movie, but except for a potential dystopian future, I don't know if there are a lot of parallels here. Then we have this movie that I'm really excited to watch because I've never seen it before, Time Runner. And that's right, it has Luke Skywalker or Mark Hamill in the main role. And apparently it involves time travel, aliens trying to take over the world, and, as you can see from the image, lots of action from Mark Hamill himself with what seems to be a gun. But the thing is, this movie also has horrible reviews, so I don't expect much, and neither should you. And also in terms of prediction, and in terms of aliens possibly invading Earth in 2022, also very, very unlikely. Time travel, don't expect that either. Oh, and also no dystopian future. As a matter of fact, Earth has just 1 female president, and things are generally going fine, except for that alien invasion. But I guess they had to make a movie interesting somehow. And then the last on the list is The Dark Side of the Moon. And this one seems to combine quite a lot of different topics. But it does seem to have some sort of a nuclear-armed satellite that needs to be repaired. And it also involves some sort of a supernatural activity, and according to this poster, something is waiting. But from what I understand, this movie also talks about how NASA is no longer a thing, and most of the space exploration is done by private companies. And although this might happen eventually, maybe in a few decades from now, it's not happening anytime soon. Most of the private companies today are still in their growing phase. Nevertheless, still probably worth watching just for the sake of learning of what we believed 2022 would be like back in 1990. But more importantly, it will be interesting to reflect on this in 2023 when we kind of go through the year and see how many of these do come true. I just hope it's not the alien invasion or that whole prison situation with everyone living on a single island. But here it's also important to understand that, generally speaking, when we try to predict an actual event, it practically never happens. Here I'm really looking at more of a qualitative approach, where we try to predict a set of possibilities. And although time travel and various types of aliens is very unlikely to happen, a lot of themes in movies like Soylent Green are unfortunately a bit of a problem today as well. And one of the reasons I wanted to make this video is because of something H.G. Wells said a long time ago, back in the 30s. This is of course the iconic author behind The War of the Worlds and the winner of many different science fiction awards. During an interview in the 30s, he actually put an emphasis on a major change in our society to rely more on the so-called professors of forethought as opposed to professors of history. In other words, he believed that it's important for us to try to predict the future as scientifically as possible, using as much current understanding as possible. And he believed it was necessary for one single reason: being ready for any potential disasters and preparing humanity for any future negative change, or positive change, or any change. In that particular case, he was actually referring to the ideas of how the world changed completely when cars became quite common. And then obviously this also applies to a lot of other inventions like computers, internet, and so on. And so using science and using science fiction to explore these potential scenarios and even develop strategies for how to deal with these scenarios, he believed was really important, and honestly I don't disagree with him at all. It's definitely something that would be very desirable and something that we should be able to do by essentially learning from our mistakes in the past and by trying to predict what might happen in the future. So not really predicting the future itself, just predicting the possibilities and knowing how to deal with them if they happen. More importantly though, it has been done in the past using mathematics and using some of the computer algorithms, and more specifically very recently, and you can actually read about this in one of the articles in the description. This person right here predicted the mayhem and essentially the chaos that happened in the US in 2020s. And he did so using a very thorough analysis in 2010. And though obviously nobody could expect this to really happen, things like this and papers like this are extremely important to basically help us avoid future mistakes or to guide us to a better future, not a dystopian future as shown in some of these movies. And so definitely not something we can just do to watch science fiction movies and to see if there were predictions that came true, but something that can in theory influence the cultural evolution of humans to something that's slightly better than it would be otherwise. But on that note, that's kind of pretty much all I wanted to mention. All of the links and all of the relevant media are in the description below, and I guess some of these movies you can technically watch on YouTube for free. Once again, I'm not entirely sure the legality of this, but they seem to be there and nobody seems to be doing anything about it, and also some of them might actually not be available anywhere else. Either way, I'm definitely going to be watching them, so there you have it. On that note, thank you for watching, hopefully you enjoyed this video, slightly different from the usual content, but it's a New Year's and I'm basically on a few-day holiday here, and I'm going to be watching this in my free time. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye-bye. And if I were to make a prediction about the future of Metaverse, I think it's going to be a huge flop. So big as a matter of fact that we're going to look back at it and say, yeah, that was silly.